Good evening. Hello, hello, hello. Uh-oh, don't make me get my MBA teaching voice on. You're all very welcome. Welcome to the King Center and the first in what will be a thematic series of conversations this year on the future of aid, starting with innovating under tighter constraints. For those of you who are new to the King Center, we are Stanford's research hub for all things global development. So we span the entire university, we span all the schools, all the disciplines, all the ages and stages of people's career, from undergrads through pre-docs, postdocs, junior faculty, senior faculty. And we really try to do three things. So we try to fund innovative research. We train the next generation of global leaders. And then we convene in conversations like this one about critical topics in global development. So you see, we have funded projects around the world. There's a variety of thematic sectors, from not like bread and butter of health and education to governance and data and technology. A lot of what we try to do is seed kind of big, bold ideas and give people a chance to experiment. And then the ones that really grow, they could, they fly and they scale up and they move beyond us. And that always makes us very excited. I want to announce we have a new initiative that we are launching this fall, which is a student and alumni group. So it's focused on global development. And so we actually have two of the initial bold alums who are doing this right here in the front row. So Radhika Shah and Diva Sharma are here. If you can raise your hand. They're starting their conversation really about kind of AI and innovative technology and how that can be used to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you're interested in joining that group and joining that conversation, please catch them afterwards, or you can scan the QR code. Tonight, I am super excited to moderate a discussion with our very distinguished panelists. We have Rachel Glennerster here, who's the president of the Center of Global Development. She has held many previous jobs in different facets of this. So she was a professor at the University of Chicago. She was the chief economist at FCDO, which is the UK bilateral. She was the executive director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. She's also involved in really big global campaigns like Deworm the World and Teaching at the Right Level. We're super excited to hear her. She's a dear personal friend and a mentor to me, so super special to have her here. And then I'd also like to introduce Norma Altshuler, who is, I hope to be, a new friend and mentor. But she is with Open Philanthropy. She's a senior program officer for global aid policy. And she also has had an incredible career and array of positions in the space. So she's previously worked with the Hewlett Foundation, Global Innovation Fund, Give Directly. She's a portfolio manager within the USAID for their Development Innovation Ventures, DIV, which is a super exciting approach to development, and involved in a lot of social enterprises in East Africa. So they have critical roles at huge organizations that are at the center of this debate about, where do we go from here with aid. But what I appreciate about both of them is through their career, they've really tried to tackle this problem from a number of different perspectives and really creative approaches. So quick word on format. I'm going to ask each of them just to spend a few minutes giving a little bit of an introduction to who they are, what their organization does, kind of the big ideas that they're thinking about today. I'll moderate. I have some questions that I'd like to ask them, and then I'll kind of take breaks and collect a few questions from the audience and then go back to chatting with them myself. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our panelists. So Rachel, you want to take it away?
Kick off. Okay, great. So what you missed out on your list was we're co-authors.
Oh, yes, that too.
Papers together. Now I think someone is going to put up a slide because I was asked to just give a little bit of background on how big are the aid cuts that we're facing. So this is just some data to give you a little bit of perspective, and then I'm just going to talk. But I thought it would be useful to just give a little bit of data. So this is just the OECD development agencies, and you see a big cut between 2023 and 2026. And then you can see what percentage that is coming from the US cuts, which we hear a lot about because they're very dramatic, shutting down a whole aid agency. But actually, you're seeing very big cuts in other big OECD aid funders. So the UK, big cuts, Germany, France, and then there are a few countries that are still increasing their aid, but it's in no way is it making up for those gaps. And then, how big is that in terms of individual countries? What are they facing? Well, the other chart on here is showing some of the countries. It's a bit of a projection. It's based on, who used to fund which country, and then we're just kind of assuming proportionately they're going to cut, across the board in these different countries. And so we're projecting which countries are going to face the biggest shortfalls in funding. And you can see that some countries are facing really significant falls in GNI. So, 6%, 4% of GNI just from reductions in aid. So that's, it's going to hit some countries and some sectors very, very hard. It's important to recognize, though, by the way, there's some seats down the front, so please come in. It's important to recognize, though, that if you're thinking about development in general, the people who do the most funding of development is A, the poor themselves. So if you think about, education and health, who's spending most money on that? It's poor people in poor countries. And then next biggest is low and middle income country governments. So, development is not stopping. There's still a lot of work to do in terms of, the kinds of work that we all do of trying to make sure that development funding is spent effectively. The multilateral development banks are still very big funders, and they have not seen the same kind of cuts as these bilateral aid funding cuts. So most, big forms of flows into low and middle income countries come from these loans from the multilateral development banks. And because they're loans, they're not affected by the aid cuts. Now, the loans to low-income countries are subsidized by these funders. And so those are going to be, and those are very large amounts of money because, $1 of aid from, say, the UK government ends up translating into $3 or $4 in subsidized loan from somewhere like the World Bank. So it really gets leveraged and multiplied. So they are very big sources of funding. At the moment, we don't see huge cuts in the IDA, the subsidized lending, but it's going to get much tougher because some countries are falling down, and they're becoming low income. Places like Sri Lanka used not to need subsidized loans, but now they do. We've got huge debt problems, and so countries need more subsidized loans. So that's going to get a lot tougher. So on top of this, as a result of these bilateral aid cuts, you're also going to see some cuts over time in the subsidized lending. So that's kind of the picture of where we are. What do we do about it? That is, I think one of the things that I've been talking about, and this is something that was sensible to do anyway, but I think it's become much more important with these cuts, is what I'm calling radical simplification. What do I mean by that? I mean, as a bilateral funder, we should be funding fewer countries, making fewer loans, but making those loans or grants, we should be making those much bigger. So fewer but bigger grants, really focused on the things that we know are effective. And when I spent many years working what are the most effective things to do in development. But when I moved into government, the thing that shocked me most was the fact that a lot of programs tried to do, 15 different things in one program. And it just made it so hard to procure, because there were very few people who could do all 15 things that you were asking for. It made it almost impossible to evaluate, because there were, 15 different bits of it, but, maybe 20 different goals, and, just it was made up of so many different components that it was very difficult to say how this program worked overall. And so we really need to focus on, when we've got less money, we need to focus on what we know works and do it at scale. Why am I insisting so much that we should do fewer programs and bigger scale? Because the evidence is that there's huge economies of scale in development. There's a lot of data, really nice data from the IRC, where they've looked at the cost per head of their programs for, cash transfers or building toilets in refugee camps, or like all these different things that they do. And you look at their graphs, and you've got cost and scale, and the cost just falls dramatically. The cost per head falls dramatically for bigger programs. And yet we faff around doing lots of really small programs. So we should just focus on a few things that we really know works and do them at very big scale, and we'll get so much more impact. So that's my, there are many other things that we can talk about, but that's my main push about what can we do faced with this, very challenging environment.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel. I want to talk about two things that are related to what I think people in this room, or at least some of you, might be able and willing to help with in this extremely difficult moment. One is around prioritization, very much aligned with Rachel. I think that as we think about making scarce dollars go further, we do have to think about what's geopolitically realistic and realize that has always been, and now more than ever, is going to govern a lot of where aid flows. But I think within that, there's still a lot of room to be thinking about what's about impact as well as about politics. And so, for example, if you think about where aid flows to, what countries are selected and what countries receive the most money is very heavily influenced by geopolitics. Not entirely, but very heavily. And I don't think we can change that right now. But what I do think we might be able to change is to change within a country what parts of the country are prioritized. So surprisingly, what countries have the highest burden of a specific disease is not nearly as highly correlated as it should be with where funding that is trying to combat that disease goes. And so that's the kind of thing I think that can be, on the margins, really important. The other thing that I think is important, right, and so the reason I say this is important to people in this room is that this often involves quite a lot of hard analytics, and so I think that room for quant nerds to be thinking about this, both with governments who are listening to data and evidence, but also with in terms of donor governments, but also with low and middle income country governments. The other thing I think we need to be thinking about right now is bold ideas, and ideas that are cheap enough that they can be paid for by both existing smaller donor funds and or by the relatively small amounts that philanthropists, like the institution that I represent, can cover, politically salient, or better yet, both. So I want to give you a couple examples of what this can look like. But first, I do want to say that new ideas have been a big part of what have motivated aid increases in the past and have motivated philanthropists. So for example, PEPFAR, the US's big AIDS program, arose because of momentum, in part because of momentum coming out of the aid crisis. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is an unusually high-performing part of the US development apparatus, came about in part because of the Bush administration's focus on results and metrics. Right now, themes that matter in the US and in some in other countries as well include protecting supply chains and diversifying away from countries that we may not have the best geopolitical relationships with. And another theme that matters right now, and that was front and center of the global health strategy that the Trump administration released recently, is surveillance, finding diseases, and containing them. There will be other ideas that maybe will be on the table and other themes in future administrations, be they Democratic or Republican, and it's not too early to start thinking about ideas now. Two examples. One is a solution that's already out there, that's already out there and implemented by aid agencies, ready-to-use therapeutic foods. So this is basically fortified peanut butter. You have peanuts, and often, critically, peanuts grown in the US and that are packed with nutrients. It's around $45 to treat children who, over a course of 6 weeks, who are in really, really difficult health circumstances. And part of why this has been able to attract US government funding in the past is because of the Made in America angle, of course. But another part is the visceral human impact that you can see. Some of our partners have taken Congress people and other important people who are in politics to see these programs in clinics. You walk into a clinic, you see a kid who has just come in, who is in very bad shape, and you see a kid who's towards the end of that 6 weeks, who viscerally seems a lot better. This is one of the programs that I think has so far seems to be doing really well in terms of being spared from cuts, and I think may even have the potential to grow in this administration, as well as in future ones. I also think that if we think about new ideas, I want to point to an idea that is taken off in part thanks to work here at Stanford. Lead poisoning is something that people estimate kill about 1.5 million people per year. And it also, as you know, probably already all know, have significant other impacts, including cognitive effects on children. Some of Rachel's colleagues at the Center for Global Development did really important work to help shine the light on that problem. And Jenna Forsyth and Steve Luzzi here at Stanford did really important work to show that, among others, that it could be solved, or at least partially solved. In Bangladesh, they found that people were literally mixing lead into turmeric because it's prettier that way. And so finding that once they found that, they were able to work with the government on policies around taking it out and around both having regulations and enforcing them that have made a big difference in terms of reducing lead poisoning in that country. You can literally detect it in blood levels. So that's the kind of idea that it can be resonant. You know, we've all read about lead in this country, and it's also cheap enough that philanthropists, including us, have been able to make a significant contribution towards that. So in this moment, I do think that we have to be, I don't want to sound like I'm sugarcoating things, but I do think that working on prioritization and working on what are new ideas, including ideas that might take off in a number of years from now, is something that can be helpful.
Great. Thanks, Norma. I want to come back to the hole. You have a big pit of money that is gone, and thinking about ways to start filling that back up. So there's the G20 president commissioned this report last year about a coordinated minimum wealth tax, which Gabriel Zuckman did some estimates about what that would look like. Basically, it's like a billionaire's tax. So if you tax them 2% of their wealth, this only affects like 3,000 people worldwide, but that would generate $200 to $250 billion every year. So the question is, like, the money is there. How do we unlock it and harness it and put it towards challenges in low-income countries? And I just want to have like real clear-eyed, realistic discussion of like, is that ever going to happen? Are these ultra-high net worth people in through philanthropy going to step in? What would that look like? Maybe Norma, if I can start with you with your perspective on this.
Sure. I think that it is unrealistic that the full size of the gaps that we see will be covered, although if anybody has a checkbook that wants to step up, I think we can all give you a round of applause. But I do think that there's room for both some philanthropists to come out of the shadows, and for some governments to step up with small but mighty donations. On the government side, so South Korea is an example of a country that went from being an aid recipient to being one of the top 15 aid donors. And that's a pretty unique case. We don't have a lot of those. But what we have seen is that there are some other countries that have started to consider or make contributions to multilateral health funds for the first time. So for example, Uruguay, Greece are some of the countries that have done or are considering this. These are donations that are in the millions of dollars, so important, but a small size of that gap. But I also think that there's a chance that they have ripple effects in terms of showing that there's still global solidarity around this, that kind of thing. In terms of philanthropists, I would just go back to what I said earlier about real concrete solutions being very motivating. And so the lead work that I mentioned, we have a $100 million fund that we run on that, but actually only a minority of that comes from open philanthropy, because donors were excited enough about the fact that the work I mentioned that came out of here at Stanford, extraordinarily cost effective. We estimate it saved 200,000 lives at about $100 a life. That's basically unprecedented. And we can't expect that from every solution. That's very unusual, but even from every solution in the lead work. But this is the kind of thing that can convince donors to pool funds. And when we pool funds, we can both set higher levels of ambition and make people like Rachel's life easier, because there's fewer difficult donors to wrangle. And so I do think that that kind of thing, and we're staffing up a partnerships function to try to help advise more ultra high net worth individuals on being part of these sorts of initiatives, can fill important parts of the gap.
Yeah, so I think I agree with Norma that it's unlikely that philanthropy is going to be able to fill these size of holes. I think there's some very important areas that they are particularly well suited to. So one of the things that has very high returns is doing research and development on new solutions. So, everything from finding out that lead was a problem to how do you solve it, to, the new malaria vaccine, to, the cost-effective interventions that we talked about. Like, somebody had to go out and, whether it be the ultra-poor program or bed nets, like somebody went out and did the research and found out that, those were highly cost-effective things to do. And so, and that is, I said at the moment that the multilateral development banks are sort of really kind of the main source of external funding to a lot of these low and middle income countries, but they're not well suited to doing R&D. So there's, and finding, they're quite good at scaling up the things that you find work, but they're not well suited to investing in something that is not targeted at a particular country. It's about learning in the whole world. So I think it's important to think about which gaps can be filled by which people. And I think R&D is something that philanthropists and also bilateral donors, are well placed to do, but it's getting really hit by the fact that the bilateral donors are going down. I think, in terms of these solutions for, can you tax wealth, the issue is that you need to, very often you need to coordinate, you need to coordinate on that. So there was this agreement in the G7 and the EU to have a minimum corporate tax, which was a fantastic idea, because that's the kind of thing where you get competition and, and then the US defaulted. So the same is true with, people are finding that with the wealth taxes, that people can move. I think you can probably do more on property tax, potentially, including in low and middle income countries. I think we ought to be doing more on property tax, and there's some really interesting research work on that, because you can't move that.
Yeah.
But I think it's very useful to point out that the money is there, but it's, unless you get the right political environment where you can coordinate, I think it's quite hard to do, unfortunately.
Yeah. Building on your coordination points, obviously if you're going to do something like that, you'd have to coordinate on actually enforcing this. But if we leave that aside and just talk about, there are new players coming in with larger amounts of money. Like, Bill Gates announced he's spending it down faster. Maybe that spins off, I don't know, an extra $5 billion a year. And this kind of comes back to your point, Norma, of, philanthropists are motivated by specific causes that they feel passionate about. And if there's this sort of a beautiful proliferation of new sources of money coming in, but that have a very clear agenda of what they want to do and where, that's a different coordination problem of, like, if you take the perspective of a low-income country government, if I'm the president, how do I get all of these sources of money in line and respecting, like, my domestic agenda and filling the gaps that I have when I have them, which seems to be another complicated coordination problem.
Is that for me?
You can start, and then I'll go to Norma.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting problem and a really important problem, because I've spent enough time in, low and middle income countries talking to governments and just seeing how the few, really good, effective people in government are just swamped by all the people who want to talk to them, and it takes up so much of their time. This was not a very low-income country, but the worst example I had was, working in a country just after the transition from communism, and everything in this country was run through one computer system, right? The banking system, tax collection, all the government funding, it was all in one, and there was one guy who knew how this system worked. And everyone wanted to talk to him, because if you wanted to find out what was going on, and I'm like, leave the poor guy alone, he's literally running the country. So that's a bit of an exaggeration, that's a bit of a, worst case scenario. But, you see that in, you see kind of the equivalent in lots of places. So what do we do? There's a lot of conversations now about, can you do, let's take health. Can you do a prioritization exercise of saying, what are the needs in this country? What are the health needs? And then this is the budget. If you add up the government money and the donor money, and then the cost per DALI for the different interventions, and you can literally do a kind of optimization exercise, which says, well, this is, we should spend this much on malaria and this much on TB, and then you can do that optimization exercise and then kind of say, okay, this donor has a comparative advantage in HIV, you do the HIV, this donor has. Now, donors don't like being kind of pushed around that way, and being told what to fund. But if you take into account what their comparative advantage is, I think actually it makes it easier. So we're calling this, well, this is my twist on something that CGD's been working on with these health compacts, and we're going to try and, see if we can work with different countries to see if we can make this happen. But if you're the Rwandan government, that's how you do things. This is my plan. This is what I want to spend money to. I'm only interested in talking to you if you can fit into the plan. I think they go a little bit far, but not everybody can pull that off. But I think we do need a lot better coordination, and we used to do it. The World Bank used to play a role in doing that, and we need to get back to working better together. By the way, if you do what I said about each donor works in fewer countries, that really helps with the coordination too, because the expert in the Ministry of Health is only dealing with, 10 donors instead of 25.
Yeah, I would add that I think that one bright spot I've seen is equipping people in ministries of finance, ministries of health, whatever the relevant sector ministry is, with technical support. So for instance, in one of the challenges that people talk about a lot these days is vertical health programs. So you have a program for malaria, a program for HIV, a program for maternal and child health, and you literally have different trucks going out to deliver commodities for those different programs, and sometimes those trucks are only half full. So one of our partners, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, helped work with several governments to say, all right, well, what if we can just literally consolidate the deliveries and just get them all on one truck? And that's a small example of efficiency gains that can just come from centralized planning and from some donor interest in being willing to see these kinds of changes in their programming. On the philanthropic front, I would say a couple things. First of all, I think that the pooled fund stuff that I talked about is one example, but another example, and congruent with Rachel's point about fewer countries from sovereign donors, is just picking lanes that are relatively empty. So for example, in our work at Open Philanthropy, the aid policy work that I do is actually pretty unusual in terms of being a space where there are a lot of other donors. We often try to focus on areas like South Asian air quality, where we're one of the only funders in that space, on the theory that then there's a lot more value we can add.
Great. Okay, let me open it up to all of you. I'll just collect maybe 3 questions in this round, and then don't worry, there'll be another round. Just raise your hand. We've got some mics going around. In here. Yeah.
I won the lottery. Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I took a good note of something that Rachel mentioned, and maybe I would love to hear from both of you, or the 3 of you, if you can. You say directly, let's fund what we know works and what is at scale. And I want to know, who is we? Is we in the room? Can I talk to we? I'm Luisa Ortiz, and I run a global helpline on mental health.
Great. Okay, let's get a couple more.
Thank you. Yes, a comment and a question. I take your point about fewer projects targeted and at scale, but I wonder if that, although relevant, is missing sometimes the point, the geopolitical point that was made by the second speaker about having to spread the geography around and the political influence around, as well as some countries, as was pointed out, aren't really up to, and some donors, up to managing large projects. I saw a lot of that working with, as a contractor at times with USAID. And the other question is more about China. There's no reference to China and the huge amount of money China is pouring into various forms of development, largely CapEx, but where does that fit in your strategy?
Okay, hi. I'm Catherine Stoner. I'm a political scientist here and the director of the sister center of the King Center, the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. So I have to ask a democracy, development, rule of law question, which actually fits nicely with the previous question regarding capacity building. You were speaking more as economists in a sense, in that if we just get the right intervention, then we can just apply it and it'll work. And obviously you well know that it doesn't often work that way. Often there is a lack of capacity to either absorb the aid or to actually implement the perfect intervention that you have. So can you say something about how the decrease in US funding may also affect this basic governance capacity in a lot of the recipient countries?
Should we start there? You have
I
anything you'd like
think
to
you're
respond
starting
to?
with Norma.
Great. I'll just respond to a few of these points. On country capacity, which a few folks hit on, I would say that we have to just be very specific and practical about what we can do in given situations. I think there continues to be a role for programs that are implemented by NGOs or other people other than governments, and sometimes that is just a cost-effective way to solve problems in various situations, including when a state is low capacity, and among other situations. But there also are times when a government-run program is what makes sense, or when there are more sort of hybrid approaches that can be useful, and we just have to be very specific and tangible about what the situation is. On China, I mean, I think that the evidence shows that Chinese development does contribute to development outcomes, and some more than others, in some contexts more than others, and that is certainly not going to be filling the gaps, both for a variety of reasons, including that there's a particular focus on certain kinds of projects, including certain kinds of infrastructure projects that are only part of the puzzle.
Great. Normally I only want to pick one, but there were 3 great questions. So, when we say what we know works, what's the we? So let me give you an example of how I've tried to solve that. So when I was in the UK government, we set up, we being me and the head of the education sector at the World Bank, we set up what we called the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which was a panel of people who know about evidence to give advice to low and middle income country governments about what works. What did we do? Who's on the panel? Well, it takes people from all over the world. So it's, someone from Latin America and South Asia and Europe and they're also from different disciplines. So we have economists and psychologists and implementers, but implementers who know about evidence and and education experts, and then we did a systematic review of the evidence, sat down together, and we just pounded until we got consensus on what we were going to advise governments to do. And that was partly on cost and effect, but it was also on, we used descriptive data. We had qualitative researchers on the panel. The economists got challenged that we were using, the wrong metrics, and just out of that came, I think, a very robust set of what was the consensus view about what governments should do. Now, obviously, governments get to do what they want, but it was a way to bring a lot of different evidence together and synthesize it. And we also looked at, we didn't just make recommendations, we made recommendations and said, this is the kind of context where you would want to do this. So if you have this problem, this is a good solution. It wasn't like everyone do these 5 things. It was no, if you have this problem in your country, think about doing this. And the other thing we did is we didn't recommend anything that hadn't been implemented at scale by a government. Not that it had always been tested at scale, but at least a government can make this happen everywhere. It's not, it's not only being tested or tried in a few. So that's what I mean by what do we know works. It's got to, for me, it's got to hit all of those things. And, I'd love to see us do more of that kind of thing. By the way, the few things at big scale, my one condition that's not that is the R&D side, because I think we need to constantly be doing small things to see what's the next big thing. On China, I would say, and yes, the politics are a nightmare. I've been in the UK government where we were cutting aid by, 30%. The politics of, can you actually shut down a country? You know that people will scream if you cut water, there's a constituency. Yes, it's like that. We've still got to argue for the right thing. China, I think it's really important to think about the different kinds of money that comes from China. So effectively, some of what they're giving is very much like aid, and other things are basically state-owned enterprises making investments. And like, we just have to think about that differently. It's the equivalent of our private companies going and, building something and hoping to make a return. So be careful when you talk about China and, the evil things that they're doing. Like, sometimes you want to compare it to what a private company from the West is doing. On democracy, I think that's, that's what Kate and I write about together, right? So I care a lot about that. I think, what I love about that part of economics and political science, that, we work together and, do very similar things across those two disciplines. But I actually think, therefore, there's some things that we can do to improve how effective politicians are. Like, how do we get better politicians elected? Now, that's different from capacity. You ended up asking about capacity. Yeah, and I think, it's very depressing to see some backsliding on democracy in, across the African continent, across Asia. Yeah, I know, that's not my field, but yes. What's really interesting is how widespread it is. But on the other hand, let's go to the evidence that actually shows that there's some things that we can do. Yes, exactly. And everyone was getting very depressed about democracy, and Kate and I were like coming out with this positive things about what you could do of improving democracy. So I'm going to, I'll leave the capacity building side to what Norma said.
Okay, I want to just pick up on the politics questions. I heard some murmuring in the audience. So I do want to talk about the politics of AIDS in the United States and other wealthy countries, right? Because our capacity to give as a nation depends a lot on our interest in giving as individuals and interest in our government investing. So actually, you started with PEPFAR in some of your earliest comments. So I think it's interesting to go back and think about that. So that George W. Bush launched that in 2003. It is passed. It had a lot of bipartisan support then. It got reauthorized every 5 years with a lot of enthusiasm. So for 20 years, this was like seen on the right and on the left as an incredibly effective solution to an urgent problem in public health. And then in 2003, that started to unravel. And then, passing it became problematic. It got rolled into a big funding bill, and, now it's in jeopardy. So how do we regain common ground across a pretty disparate ideological spectrum, parts of which had been united for a long time? And what's the future there?
Yeah.
Small questions.
Very small, easy questions. Well, I would say two things. First of all, you frame this in terms of bipartisanship, which, as you said, has been historically really important to PEPFAR and to a number of other aid programs. To me, I think we need to be thinking about this both from an angle that's focused on bipartisanship, but also, frankly, from a more partisan angle. So if we think about, going back to what I opened with around big ideas, the kinds of big ideas that could matter, or certainly the framing of them, could be quite different in a new Democratic administration or a new Republican administration. And similarly, if we think about building champions, one way to do that, there are ways to do that that could be bipartisan or that could be more partisan. So for example, one of the most effective champion building tools that I've seen is study tours. I alluded to that earlier when I was talking about malnutrition, but I've seen this work for building champions for a variety of other programs. Congress people or their staff or other people in the political orbit go for a few days. They see viscerally the work, and they're also seeing it with their colleagues, which can be important for forming relationships in a partisan or a bipartisan way that then can lead to things to future collaborations on aid as well as individual championship. And there are still, I think, champions that matter. So for example, Susan Collins pushed back quite publicly against some of the PEPFAR work, and that seems to have made a difference to some outcomes there. And we've also heard about things behind the scenes where there are people in Congress who still are pushing on aid. Now, and particularly aid programs that really have been shown to have a very big human upside. Now, I don't want to sound too rosy on this. I think that the future of aid aid champions are quite thin, and including thin within the Democratic Party. We've seen historically, that there have been champions for cost-effective but I think that this also comes back to some of just what works can be quite motivating. So, for example, in past Democratic administrations, we've seen pushes like the Development Innovations Fund that I used to work at, the Office of the Chief Economist, that was about prioritizing based on evidence. And we've also, as you said, PEPFAR came out of the Republican era, so did the President's Malaria Initiative. So I think that both showing viscerally what works, as well as with evidence, can be part of what we need for champion building.
Yeah, can I just add one thing which I think we've got really bad at doing, and I'm not saying it's easy, but I think there's something that we can do about it, which is, if you think about the coalition that supported PEPFAR, it was the evangelicals who were, on mission across Africa and seeing the impact on the communities. And they were, writing back to their churches and saying, this is terrible, this is like devastating, this is devastating the community I'm in, and all the work that we've put into these communities is being, undermined by this disease. And then you had the HIV rights people in the US who were, who campaigned for, who are very, much more on the left, and somehow these two groups who, couldn't be in the same room together now, working together towards the same aim. And I think that's a huge part of the problem, is that these two constituencies for aid are just hate each other now. And we've got to somehow tie that back together. And I think part of that is the fault of the left, who have been, frankly, very condescending about people like mission groups who go. I mean, I don't know, you've spent as many hours as I have standing in line for flights from Sierra Leone. And, often in that line are mission groups who, have come and built a church or something like that. And, they're all coming from the Midwest or something, and they've had this completely extraordinary experience for them, and they're talking about it. And, yes, was that the most cost-effective use of their money to fly to Sierra Leone? No, but it's really important. And I think it's just been seen as, people are rude about, kids who go off and travel and we've just been way too critical, I think, of people who just want to learn about other parts of the world. And I think that's led to, and policing of language, and it's just, we've been so unwelcoming. It's like development is a very complicated thing. Leave it to the experts. Don't worry your pretty heads about it. And then we're surprised that people don't support it anymore. I don't think that was a good strategy.
Okay, I think we can get a couple more questions. Do we have a question here? Do we have any microphones?
Oh, over here. Sorry.
Oh, you've got one? Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Hi.
thank you. Yep.
Hi there. Yeah, just following up on that note about bipartisanship and just the kind of lack of political fallout as a result of the aid drawbacks. Part of the innovation you talked about was about innovation in regards to the interventions you're planning. But I think also a big result of the fallout is there's actually a very negative opinion of the organizations implementing these interventions, right? The belief that USAID and other similar organizations like the UN are bureaucratic, ineffective, even self-serving. So how much of the innovation in the future isn't just about the new interventions or the best interventions that we plan, but also how we rethink the kind of organizations that are implementing it and how we break through this perception that they are in and of themselves ineffective, never mind the work they do. Thank you.
Great. You have somebody? Yep.
Hi. You talked about doing small experiments and figuring out what may be the next big thing that works, but are you seeing innovation in how research and evaluations are done for it to get, both in terms of cost and time, to figure, is this working to the point where, hey, this can be advised? And yeah, actually that's...
Take one more. Oh.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much. I come from a different perspective. I was with the Stanford Seed program as a business coach with some of my colleagues here. We all lived in Africa for years as business coaches. So we have a perspective living there. And also, I have worked with USAID programs myself as a business person. And one of the things I think looking forward is to include business into your programs. I'm working with one now as a volunteer with IESC, which was a USAID-funded program, but all the funding was cut, so I'm paying for it myself because we're just about finished coming up with a solution with the farm cooperatives in Tanzania. It's a cycle of poverty, and USAID said, oh, you have to help them get loans. That was my job. Well, I got there, I said, no, the last thing they need is a loan. Their business model is broken. And I feel like today, looking at Africa and other poor countries, they are developing. And there's more startup businesses. There's more business orientation. There's accountability. As somebody said, we can't have that bureaucracy. I was in Afghanistan for a year with USAID as the senior business advisor. Sounds fancy, but it was nothing like that. However, what I saw was there were programs that were sent to Afghanistan for me to implement that had nothing to do with what they needed. Mm-hmm. The biggest problem was they had a loan program where the minimum loan was $100,000. Well, anybody in this room could tell me, well, that's ridiculous. There was no electricity in that country. They needed $1,000, $5,000 loans. And so it was a $500 million program. We didn't give out one loan. All that money was wasted. Mm-hmm. And when I asked, why didn't somebody talk to the people on the ground and come here and ask them what they needed? Well, it was too dangerous. Well, I lived there for a year. It wasn't dangerous to send me. And I thought, these big contractors cannot get these programs anymore. I could have saved USAID a ton of money. I'm a financial person. And, we have a chance to redo all this. Mm-hmm. Start thinking like a business person. Accountability. You're talking about the cost analysis. And don't have bureaucrats running these programs. It has to be entrepreneurial and people who know what it is to be in the field working with the people, not working from an office. Because I was very discouraged when I was in Afghanistan with USAID. And I tell you, we wasted billions of dollars there.
Yeah. Okay, that's another heavy-hitting triplet right there. Who wants to go first?
I can start. Well, I think that, picking up on both on two of the questions, I do think that everyone who has worked in or near any large government organization, including large development organizations, would agree that there is a lot of work to do to reform, and to your point, that is a lot of where the innovation is. And I think that there are some of this is not that hard. So for example, when I was at USAID, one of the mechanisms we were able to use was milestone-based payments. And this could be done for complicated milestones that were harder to achieve around things like results, or it could be done for very simple things like you've hired somebody, you've rolled out the program. And that kind of thing would enable us for grants that were under $1.5 million to just surpass enormous amounts of the paperwork. Not all of it. It still took longer than we wanted to get money out the door, but significant amounts of it. So I think that kind of very simple change, if we could do that for even larger awards, is the kind of thing that can just substantially both reduce bureaucracy and also just enable money to flow faster where it's needed, and also can work for a wider range of partners, including, to your point, private companies.
Yeah, so I agree that there's a lot of work that we need to do to rethink the organizations, a lot of innovation there. You know, we started setting out some ideas in this radical simplification work that I've done. One of the things that because I'd been advocating this basic idea for a while, and so one of the things I thought about a lot was, what are the bureaucratic incentives that mean that we don't do it? And so, you know, for example, one thing that you could do is with simpler programs, you could cut the review process. And people really care in bureaucracies about how long the review process is. So they want to get stuff done quickly. And so, you know, I think one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about innovations in the organization is both what is going to sell well and make people see transparently that the aid is effective. And I think that's one of the reasons to do simplification, because at the moment it's too hard to explain what USAID did, right? It's very easy to explain what PEPFAR does, and that's one of the reasons it has more public support and more political support, because you can explain what it is. It's like you get HIV medicines to people who are sick. And a lot of what it does is, you know, we try and do 15 different things in each program, and then there's 1,000 different programs, and we have no way of explaining what we're doing. So it's important for that, but it's also important for just making the organization work more effectively and spending less time on design and stuff. I wanted to pick up on your, you know, innovation in how we do R&D. And I think, yes, there's huge scope for that, but I'm also really excited to see what people are doing on that topic. And, you know, it's everything from, there's lots of innovation about using administrative data, you know, doing RCTs, but with administrative data, or doing them at big scale, or, you know, using satellite data to measure things so then you can look at a much bigger scale, you know, all the way to, you know, using AlphaFold to invent, you know, medicines that are, you know, cope with diseases of low and middle income countries that have been so neglected. So I think there's, you know, there's a ton of exciting work going on there. Every time I go back to a kind of academic conference and I hear, you know, new tweaks of new ways that people are using to do experiments. So, it would take me too long to kind of go through the list of my top ones, but I think administrative data and different data collection sources that you can do at scale is kind of an area of a lot of that. I think, you know, obviously include business. I think partly what you were talking about, though, is how much do you have to tailor things to the local context? And I think that is a really difficult challenge because, frankly, big foreign aid bureaucracies are less good at doing that. So there are some things that need more tailoring than others. And you always need some tailoring. But one thing is, you know, maybe maybe foreign aid donors should focus on the things that don't need as much tailoring. So, you know, there's some really interesting evidence about how mentorship in business can really help improve the productivity of firms. I think the question is the aid bureaucracy the right people to do that? And maybe they are, maybe they're not, but I'm just saying there's a sort of trade-off between some things need a lot of tailoring and some things don't need a lot of tailoring, like providing deworming medicine is kind of, you do, handing out bed nets, you do that the same way everywhere. And that's, I'm not completely convinced, but there is an argument that that's what aid is better at doing, and the local governments are better doing, and the stuff that needs tailoring.
All right. Well, thank you both so much, Norma, Rachel. Please, everybody, join me in thanking our fabulous panelists.